Welcome everybody. It's our second to last webinar of our 85th anniversary series, which feels like it's been an epic run. So it's lovely to see you all here today. It's lovely to have Andrew and Corine joining us. We'll be recording the papers as usual, but we won't be recording the discussion and questions at the end. So it's my pleasure to hand over to our chair today, which is Fiona Courage, Director of the Mass Observation Archive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. And I am going to hand over straight to our speakers. We have two speakers today. What we're going to do is run one and then the next, and then take questions together at the end. But what I will introduce them in advance of both of their respective talks. And we're going to start off with Corine. So welcome to Corine van Emmerik, who's a PhD candidate and an associate lecturer in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. Corine's paper draws from an ongoing side project that she's been undertaking with a small sample of 6 writers from the Mass Observation Project, whose activity with the archive covers the full length of Mass Observation Project's existence since its re-establishment in 1981 and up to the eve of the COVID-19 pandemic. So some interesting dilemmas that I think many of us who've worked longitudinally on that collection will have also encountered. So over to you, Corine.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Let me just share my screen. That it works. So hopefully you should be able to see the screen now. Once again, thank you for joining. As Fiona already said, my name is Corine van Emmerik and I'm a PhD researcher at Goldsmiths. And today I will talk about what I have called slippery data that unearthed some issues around ethical reflexivity and care whilst working with the mass observations. And so this presentation is based on an article that I wrote and that will be published hopefully at any moment. So what is it like to do research on lived experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic and how to navigate ethical concerns that were complicated by methodological issues where data is neither primary nor secondary, but something in between? Now, this asked for an intervention in the ethics of commission and also the reuse of data. So how do we actually think about reflexivity and care? And so this is what I will try to do today, to reflect on some of the methodological and ethical issues that came up while working with the mass observations. And I will try to kind of think through some of the ethical problems that for us revealed a gap in ethical procedures, in the hope to shed light on a methodological problem of this interstitial or slippery data, as we called it, and also the consequences that this has for the ethics of qualitative documentary analysis. So this is a rough outline of what I hope to talk about today. So I would like to give a bit more context about the research project that I was part of. I want to talk about the account of Grace, as I call her, because I think it really is emblematic for some of the ethical issues that we encountered. I will talk about the ethical alertness and issues, the methodological issues, ethical reflexivity and care in practice. So not just thinking about it, but also acting upon it. And I will conclude by highlighting some points that researchers wishing to engage with the MOP should be alerted to, and also offer some practical examples from the case of Grace as a tentative proposition. So what I hope to do is really take you with me on the process that I went through, basically when I encountered a diary that contained risk of harm, the ethical issues, the methodological issues, how we dealt with it, and our recommendations. So A Day at a Time is a large collaborative research project between scholars from the University of Kent, Bristol, Edinburgh, Goldsmiths, Stirling, and of course, the mass observations. that looks at the everyday experiences of time in the coronavirus pandemic. So the project has 3 key questions that aim to think through the lens of time to make sense of how people experience the pandemic. So how are people experiencing, making and remaking time? What roles are infrastructures, material objects, technologies, and regulations playing in people's changing experiences of time during the pandemic? What research methods best capture changing experiences, practices, and structures of time during the pandemic? One of these sub-projects, this day at project is called Feeling, Making and Imagining Time, Everyday Temporal Experiences in the COVID-19 Pandemic. And it was led by Rebecca Coleman from the University of Bristol and Dawn Lyon from the University of Kent. And so I was kind of the researcher on this project that was tasked with the coding and the analyzing of the entries. So there was quite an intense engagement with the data from my side as I went through all of these entries. And so part of this sub-project that I was doing with Rebecca and Dawn was the commissioning of a summer directive of 2020. And this directive was on COVID and time. And it asked questions like, how did daily lives change? How are diary writers sustaining and making new rhythms? What are experiences of time? Did it slow up? Did it slow down, speed up, or suspend? And what does back to normal mean? But also, what do you think the future might hold? And these entries could be sent between August 2020 and November 2020. And during this time, there was a lot going on because it's actually quite a long time because parts of the country already had relaxed their restrictions and other reinstated them. But people were also talking about return to normal. But in the meantime, there was also the anticipation of the second wave of the virus and further lockdowns that were indeed introduced throughout the winter in 2020, 2021. But there was also this talk about the vaccines that were being trialed, but their effectiveness was not yet known until December 2020. So basically, there was a lot going on during this period, and this was certainly reflected in the entries as well. And so there were 4 sub-themes of the directive. The first one is the rhythm and routine of the day. So we ask questions like, in what ways, if any, has time in your daily life been disrupted? Are your rhythms and routines changed again? If so, in what ways? Do you anticipate them to change also in the future, etc.? But also questions surrounding the theme of home life. So for those of you spending most of your time at home, how do you make the distinction between different times of the day? In what ways have your lives become to be in sync with others or at odds with those living with you? And what changes do you anticipate in the time of your home life in the future? But also media and technology. So have media and technologies featured in daily changes, but also waiting as a theme. So for some people, it seemed as if life has been put on hold during the pandemic. Does this feel relevant to you? For those who have been directly or indirectly affected by illness during the pandemic, how have you experienced time and waiting in particular in relation to incapacity, recovery, loss, and grief? So what cuts through these questions and these sub-themes really relate to what the project already, or the title of the project already makes clear, are themes around feelings, futures, and these kind of changing rhythms and temporalities in people's lives. So from the 758 people that the directive was sent to, and this is more than usual, we received 228 submissions. So that's a 30% response rate. And the responses were incredibly diverse. So they ranged from a single picture to just a couple of lines to 8 pictures. And again, I was analyzing all these entries with a conceptual framework in mind that we determined beforehand. And then I did further inductive coding in NVivo. And this really left us with an incredibly rich data source that seemed full of interesting patterns and topics and observations. But my first impressions of the entries were that they were quite raw and very rich, of course, but people really seemed to take the opportunity to vent some frustrations or confine their feelings to the paper. So very often it was quite difficult to actually read through these because they were very candid and open accounts of lived experiences during a very incredibly difficult period. So one story that stuck with me was that of a flower shop owner and how she helped the people who needed flowers from for funerals, for example, how she listened to the stories of people while dealing with all these restrictions that were in place, but also dealing with her own issues at home. But there's one account in particular that I want to focus on today. As already mentioned, this to me really seemed like an emblematic story that relates to the themes of today. And this is the diary of Grace. And Grace here is a pseudonym. So Grace is a woman, probably in her 60s, living in a rural setting, probably homemaker or retired. And when I read her diary, her account, this for me was really a gripping account of her then situation and also her everyday life. And it was gripping to me because she started her diary almost like the opening of a very eerie novel that immediately brought me closer to her and pulled me in. So she wrote, "Time is just frozen for me, but it's not the virus that had done it. It is my husband. I am trapped here and he is determined that I won't escape." And she then went on to describe how the lockdown period is not necessarily new to her, as she is used to being alone in the house with her husband, who can get angry and vengeful and really trying to make her life worse, as she describes. So she's completely left to her own devices because she doesn't have a family to rely on. And sometimes I get some hope when she talks about a solicitor whom she contacted to follow through with the divorce that she wants, but then becomes insecure when she didn't hear anything back. And then she sometimes also seems more upbeat when she talks about her daily walks and the people that she met along the way. So she said, "I have had long talks with many people and just say hello or wave to many more. They have helped me more than they can ever imagine. Most of them are nameless and will forever remain so to me." She also mentioned some other coping mechanisms, such as her writing of 2 diaries, of which one is normal and the other one is hidden. And it really made me wonder where she would hide it, how it was different from her normal diary, and whether her MO entry could actually be very similar to one of her hidden diaries, exactly because she seems so trusting in me, the reader of this entry. And in fact, she anticipates the questions that a reader might ask, and asks whether she thinks things will be better for her. And she gives quite an ambiguous answer that anticipates some of the ethical issues at stake here. And I just want to flag that the next slide contains the mentioning of suicide. So she writes, "Do I think that things will get better for me? I don't know. Sometimes yes. Sometimes I just give up, and I've considered suicide many times. But I know that if I kill myself, he will have won, and I will have never escaped him. How I wish I could take my life back and have my life again. This time not making the same mistakes. How many people wish for the same thing? It's never going to happen. So I just try to improve things. Now I'm in my 60s. I have a terrible feeling of running out of time. And especially this section resonated really with wider debates at the time around domestic abuse during the lockdown, for example. So this account, and she also flags this herself, really reverberates with that of many others in a similar situation. Now, how to deal with something like this when we encounter this in the coding process or in our analysis? Well, first of all, for me, it wasn't just the content that really drew me in, but it was also the way it was written that heightened my kind of ethical alertness. As I mentioned earlier, it really seemed like a diary entry, but one where the reader is addressed directly and quite personally as well. For example, she closes her entry with the following statement. I just hope that if anybody ever reads this in the future, they are free and happy with a life that means something. I send you my very best wishes and hopes for the future. So since I was reading this, I took it quite personal in a way, because she does really seem to address the reader directly. And working with the mass observation therefore requires what Annabella Pollen called an imaginative investment from the researcher, especially in cases where personal and intimate details are shared. There's this kind of felt relationship between the MO writer and the reader or researcher, and especially that, with that category of diarists who write with a reader in mind, so kind of address the reader. And there are a couple of things that raise ethical alertness when going through an account like Grace's, because these imagined relationships between the reader and the writer that I mentioned earlier are dynamics that are quite similar like that of in an interview. So you can think about an interview over email or a letter, for example. And some of the distance between the reader and writer is removed when the reader is pulled in and out of the life of the respondent. So looking through someone's past, present, or future, but also emotional events or feelings. Thus, coming closer to a diarist in these ways really requires an enhanced ethical alertness. And despite the fact that there are no visual clues like in an interview, the emotional ties and investments that are cultivated in the sense-making of someone else's life really contributes to an ethical reflexivity. And I understand ethical reflexivity here as a kind of critical and dynamic self-reflection and consideration of other relationships in the knowing and writing about others. So there's this emotional involvement and appeal to the moral responsibility of the researcher that either is intended by the writer or experienced by the researcher, or both, of course. And this sets in motion ethical reflexivity that deals with not only these conventional themes, such as anonymity, but also performs a feminist ethics of care for the well-being of the diarist, attempting to take people's stories seriously and understanding their situated needs to live well. So for me, the ethical conundrum was really as follows. I felt really a lot of unease and worry for the psychological and also physical safety of this diarist. I felt responsible because our research team formulated these questions that were in the directive that prompted this response, almost like in an interview, but I was not able to approach the diarist directly. And this prompted the question, in me, isn't ensuring the well-being of our participants one of the researchers' main responsibilities? So I felt this inability of reaching out while attempting and feeling the need to perform an ethics of care. And this is also what makes it different from, for example, the messiness of doing field work. And this conundrum was complicated by a methodological issue, namely what I called slippery or interstitial data. So the diarists send their entries to the mass observation archive and are not live research, so it's not quite primary data. But we commissioned the directive with the mass observation as data stewards, so it's also not quite secondary data. Yet the risk of harm in responses raised questions about ethical responsibility and our duty of care as the researcher. So we were wondering, what is then appropriate care in this case? So what the ethics form of universities, as well as working with the mass observations, does not really alert to issues that arose, as it's generally considered as secondary analysis. So this revealed a gap in some of the ethical procedures. Now, other data gathering bodies like Qualidata highlight ethical themes such as minimizing risk of harm, but do not explicitly refer to the duty of care of the researcher, except when a researcher should encounter information about a planned terrorist attack or suspected child abuse, then of course they should report this. So the difficulty of dealing with slippery data is further complicated by the legalistic framing of ethics that is informed by more biomedical approaches and aimed at protecting institutions. And so since the 1990s, we've seen this turn occurring and then resulting in a move away from individual concerns, such as an ethics of care, towards an understanding of ethics in terms of legal liability. And the literature on qualitative secondary analysis discusses issues of reuse of data and consent, for example, but less about ensuring the well-being of participants. And it was also important for us to take into account some of the temporal dimensions for this problem, because there is a temporal lapse between the writing and the reading of the entry. So the entries were written a few months before the analysis, which allowed us to respond relatively quickly. But an ethical sensitivity is required here in terms of bringing up painful experiences or memories, and also a temporal ethical sensitivity, as these temporal differences between the reading and the writing also require different kind of ethical responsiveness. And also the temporal distance to the data might change our emotional involvement and level of reflexivity. And of course, this might be different when longitudinal researchers deal with this data, for example. So how did we put our ethical reflexivity in practice? Well, first, I started by sharing my concerns with the other members of the research team, so with Becky and Dawn. And this was really the first step in the process of ethical reflexivity. And it was important for me also because this all happened during kind of semi-lockdown, and it was good for me to discuss some of the feelings that I had about reading some of these accounts and talk about it. And I think this is really, really important when we deal with large volumes of lived experiences where some might catch on more than others. And what we then did, because we weren't really sure what to do next, because of all of the reasons outlined earlier, we talked with the mass observation with Kirsty and Jessica. And this was incredibly helpful also to get a better sense for us about their internal processes for dealing with these kinds of things. So what we agreed on was for me to send the ID numbers to them for them to have a look and follow up if necessary. And this is how we activated our ethical reflexivity in practice. Some concluding thoughts. So the account of Grace and our grappling with it really revealed the need to attend to ethical responsibility of the researcher, to activate an ethics of care when data is not quite primary nor secondary, but really something that's in between. And this ethical uncertainty that arises when dealing with slippery data requires more reflection, so that ethical frameworks also cultivate responsibility and care for the participant alongside all the other conventional themes of ethics. And this is important due to the entanglements of us researchers within larger systems of power and social legal regulations that are cemented in institutions, and that often just seem to overlook a more attentive ethics of care. And of course, the MO archivists also emphasize some actions that they have in place to accommodate this. So they have regular communication with their volunteers that their writings will be used by contemporary and future researchers. And writers also get a confirmation that their writing has been received, but is yet to be fully processed. And from what I understood, but maybe we can discuss that later, is that the MOP is also currently updating communications so that details of support organizations are accessible should any volunteer find the directive triggering. So taking responsibility for the well-being of participants performs an ethics of care towards the diarist, really regardless of the distance between the reader and writer or researcher and researched. Such a proactive ethics could anticipate potential risk of harm that would prepare researchers for an ethical responsiveness and also potential emotional investment and ties. And additionally, it can also aid in developing ethical reflexivity that's capable of attending to the complexities of research processes and lives that are reflected in the diaries. And in such a manner, researchers might be able to better navigate the ethical complexities that can arise when working with this slippery kind of data. And also, we as researchers wanted to perform such a suggested ethics of care and ethical responsiveness. So we had a conversation with the MO team, and that we decided also for them for the first time to for the archivist to email Grace and ask her for her consent for me to discuss her entry in the paper that I wrote. And she gave the following reply that I think is worth quoting here. So she replied, I imagine that in the directive you refer to, I wrote about my current marital situation, which is not good. That anybody would find anything I write really as therapy for myself interesting and worthy of note absolutely stunned me. I can only say that I feel very honored and grateful. I would like to say that everyone at the mass observation has helped me enormously, probably without having any idea that that was the case and without ever having met me. So having this forwarded from Kirsty and Jessica, I felt incredibly relieved to read that she feels heard, recognized, and above all, cared about. And it really moved me quite a bit and also made me happy that our ethics of care made her feel like her life and story were taken seriously and that it was valued as well. So the nurturing relationship between researcher and participant are really made explicit here and emphasizes the ethics of care I've been talking about. And now, of course, I want to flag this, that this might not be a solution for everyone or every research project because of these temporal dimensions and other complications, but it was absolutely vital for us to fulfill our ethical duties as researchers, whether working on primary, secondary, or something in between. That was it. I think my time is over. I just wanted to put some of the outputs of the project, of our project, on there in case you might be interested. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Corine. There's some really thought-provoking reflections in there, and I love the concept of slippery data. We talk about messy data a lot, but I really like this sort of sense of slipperiness as well, particularly around that sort of ethical dilemma of whether it sits in the primary or the secondary methodologies that we might use. So I should have said at the start that please do feel free, if you have questions that come to you that you're worried you might forget. If you've got a brain and memory like mine, you may forget it by the time it comes to questions. Please feel free to add them into the chat, and I will cover them when we get to the question area. But meanwhile, I am going to hand over to our next speaker, Andrew Burchell, who is a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral research fellow. That's an even longer title than my job title, Andrew. That's pretty impressive. At the Centre for the History of Medicine at the University of Warwick. Andrew's currently researching the child's speech around the history of activism by people who stammer. And before doing this work, he held a short fellowship on the cultural history of the NHS project, also at the University of Warwick, working with Mass Observation Project's archive of reflections of the NHS and mental health. It has culminated in a recent co-authored paper with Professor Matthew Thompson, which longitudinally and biographically follows individual MOP writers' experiences with mental illness. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I will just get this up. Can you see the slides that I'm sharing?
Can see it. I can see your. Yeah, that's better. Perfect. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, that's good to know. And like Corine, I'd really like to sort of begin with a content warning, because obviously this paper is about disclosure, and a lot of that disclosure will be about matters relating to health, mental health, as well as another sort of link to Corine's paper, domestic abuse. So I just like to sort of warn people about that really before I start. But I'd really like to begin this paper with a quote from a mass observer whom I have given the pseudonym of Sally to. And she writes, "I do feel like I'm taking part in a sort of social research when I do my MO. But the fact that the answers are stored for years and not just used and disposed of makes a difference. I get a thrill of sorts to think this could be read by someone in years to come. Would they be trying to picture me all those years ago, sitting at a computer, typing out each letter one at a time? Where would they picture me? In a cozy lounge or a separate study? Or as in my case, up in the loft of my house? It is winter and very cold up here. Would they be trying to picture my face? Am I trying to picture theirs? It is a buzz to know that things I write now will be saved for the people from the future. And yes, I do realise that it is also used by people today, and that is fun too. What must they think of me?" And when I first read this among her submissions, I found it very emotive and very, very moving. And I think partly it goes back to what Corine was saying about the sort of the interpersonal, intertemporal nature of the archive, of speaking across time to another human being. And I think it really reflects the ability of mass observation as a style of writing to offer a degree of immortality for ordinary, although I will insert that very much in large scare quotes, people. But what I really like to draw attention to here are the small, almost microscopic acts of individual disclosure that this writer makes even in quite a short extract, such as this one, from her technological limitations with the computer keyboards, to her draft The Attic, and then the kind of almost imperceptible use of the possessive pronoun my MO, which may disclose, I think, more about her relationship, her effective relationship to mass observation as a project. And in the rest of this directive response, which is 2004's being part of research, Sally participated in contributed various sort of meta reflections about her participation in the mass observation project. And she discussed this particularly through the question of privacy and the limits, in the sense of what she would be prepared to disclose to the project. So she regarded, for instance, as topics that were private, such things as, and I quote, whether or not I dye my hair, as well as how she votes in general elections. And anyone who's read her election directive responses will attest that is definitely the case. Yet, for all this focus on privacy, it's remarkable the areas where she is, in a sense, quite happy to disclose. For instance, her lack of love for her husband, for instance, whom she regards as quite boring and brutish, and her continuous extramarital affairs as a way of obtaining some satisfaction from her marriage. So reading mass observation longitudinally and following individuals through has been at the center of recent work by James Hinton and various others. And in many ways, because I'm a historian, it's James Hinton's method that's really inspired this current paper in terms of its methodology. And Claire Langhammer's work on the nature of a sort of archive of feeling, an archive of affect in mass observation, also serves to remind us of the effective emotional work of mass observation, both in its effects on the reader and for the writers themselves. And I'd like to suggest that one reason that we should pay attention to how the writing panel and its members seek to disclose things is precisely because the effect and effective power of mass observation often hinges on acts of accretive disclosure. So as Fiona said in sort of the introduction, my own background to using mass observation comes through a short stint on the cultural history of the NHS project here at Warwick in 2019. And on that, I collaborated with Matthew Thompson, who was one of the co-investigators. And we used the NHS directives of 1997, 2008, and 2018 to identify a sample of 54 writers, so around 35 women and 19 men, who disclosed mental health conditions in various forms over their life course. And of course, again, disclosure on our part, of course, the 2018 directive was commissioned by the NHS project at Warwick. So this culminated in an article in Social History of Medicine, and central to that piece was the application of composure, which is a concept relating to the narration of life history testimony developed by Graham Dawson and then further elaborated by Penny Summerfield. And Summerfield really used this as a concept with oral history interviewing techniques and related it to the ability of narrators to situate their lives in a coherent narrative of the personal and the political. Even as an oral history concept, though, there's fruitful ground here to apply this to mass observation, even if the composition here, of course, is nearly always a written text in prose form rather than a recorded interview. And so off the back of this project, really, I've been trying to find time to develop this idea and kind of work with a much smaller sample of about 5. I initially thought 6, but actually I realized that was far too much work. So about 5 writers in order to broaden the breadth of the responses. So for example, in the mental health sample, it was only really possible to sample material across a couple of responses in each decade. And we often targeted it to directives where we thought we would find people's reflections on their health. But here I wanted to do a kind of more focused reading of at least, several decades worth of responses by a particular writer within the sample. Though I should stress, of course, that I haven't actually recreated the sample. I'm still using the mental health sample. So in some ways, this probably reflects the sort of disclosures that we'll find that I'll talk about later on. I should probably talk briefly about method, which is that I usually take notes from the directives, then I sort of write these up in little pen portraits, and I'll kind of offer a flavour of some of those a little later on. But the key aim here really is not just to think about the longitudinal reading of mass observation in a totalizing way. So simply trying to amass responses and then reorder the sort of basic data in such a way that you get a chronology of an individual writer's life, but instead to think about how members of the writing can actually use their writing as part of deliberate or possibly even only semi-conscious strategies of disclosure. And I think this was inspired in the case of the mental health piece by seeing panel members using their responses as a form of therapy, rather like the example that Corine gave when we were doing the reading for that. And so I think it matters then which directives elicit disclosure and which do not. And so for me, I kind of see disclosure and mass observation in kind of 2 ways. So on the one hand, as with oral history interviews, disclosure in mass observation can often be accidental. So writers might not realize the weight or the importance of what they reveal in their writing. At times, readers might only be able to contextualize the importance of something in light of other submissions and directive responses by the same writer. I think particularly of Liz Stanley and Andrea Salter's work on the temporality of the archive and the kind of intersection of the researcher's time with the time that's being looked at. Writers may well only disclose accidentally in order for certain comments to make sense, such as, for example, disclosing their religious beliefs or their sexuality. At other times, they may even do this apologetically, fearing that their status as Christian or a gay man or as someone who has no children might make their views somehow unrepresentative or sort of invalidate the sample for the researchers using mass observation, even though, of course, that's definitely not the case. However, I also want to think about the kind of deliberate, kind of incidental use of disclosure, how the writers often use repeated disclosures as a way to exercise agency in and through their testimony. And this can take the form of specific narrative choices or strategies or of larger scale meta-reflections on their disclosures themselves. And sometimes these disclosures may well be in harmony with broader cultural scripts or accepted framings and styles of disclosure. So, for example, as on this slide, recent campaigns around mental health, for instance, have stressed disclosure as a powerful act to initiate therapy or broader feelings of self-acceptance. But there are others, of course. I mean, oral history being one of them, confessional culture, sensationalist journalism, even reality television. You know, they all offer many different forms for research in what Ken Plummer famously identified as the documents of life, in which, of course, he also included mass observation itself. But much of this, I think, remains within certain discursive parameters. And so, as Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick reminds us powerfully in her analysis of coming out of the closet, disclosure is defined as much by the thing that it opposes, silence. And there are equally various gradations, if you like, of disclosure, the levels of publicity in circles of privacy versus exposure. And again, I think this is especially relevant with mass observation because you're dealing with something which is inherently temporal and where these things can change over time. And of course, it also depends and largely on who the given writers see as their audience. Are they writing to archivists? Are they writing to a sort of specific or kind of imagined researcher in the present, as we heard in Corine's paper? Or are they just, in a sense, shouting into a void for the sake of posterity? And moreover, the kind of the assured anonymity of the panel members also creates its own, and quoting Sedgwick here, discourse that differentially constitutes acts of disclosure. And this, I think, makes mass observation very interesting to, say, other forms of qualitative research like face-to-face oral history. So without further ado, I'd kind of like to sort of segue into exploring some of these individual writers who I've been working with. So Margaret, born in 1926, is the oldest writer and has also been active, I think, for one of the longest continuous time periods of probably anyone in the kind of initial cohort of mass observation recruits. And within that time, she's produced a remarkable body of writing. So Margaret was born in Wales and proudly identifies herself as working class. She notes that she was kind of within a sort of respectable, I guess, slightly wealthier end of the working class, but she notes that due to the illness of both her brother and of her mother, the household budget was largely subsumed by medical bills. Her father took the decision to relocate the family to southern England when Margaret was 12, believing that the family would have better opportunities, both educationally and also for class advancement. However, this isn't the case. Margaret actually found the opposite to be true. The schooling in southern England she found to be of an inferior quality to what she'd experienced in Wales, that there were lower expectations for working class children, and also limited opportunities specifically for girls to undertake further training. And she writes quite movingly how she had to give up on her dream of training to become a seamstress. So instead she married and settled into part-time seasonal work in the local holiday economy, including work in a fish and chip shop, which if anyone's wondering why there's a picture of a fish and chip shop on the slide. And her experience of, having seen the family budget being, being gradually eaten away by medical costs, makes her a sort of lifelong, gives her a lifelong devotion to the National Health Service. Now, Margaret's husband was forced to give up work due to chronic illness in the 1970s and died in the 1980s. And the result of this is a long-term financial precarity. Margaret describes saving every penny, finding income sources wherever she can, avoiding bus travel and preferring to walk. And she also discusses her own health. After initial problems conceiving after her marriage, she was helped by a specialist, which is another reason why she loves the NHS, and eventually gives birth to 6 children, of whom only the first 2 were planned. And for her last pregnancy, she reveals that she came under pressure to have an abortion, and she had to stand her ground with her husband and her GP and eventually had the child. Now, Margaret's writing style is very much a stream of consciousness. And I think this is partly a result of the fact that she handwrites her responses and often doesn't bother with drafts, as she admits in one of the 1990s directives. And it produces this great sort of rhythm to her responses. There's often this, erratic fluctuation between the various sub-themes and questions of the directive. But she equally is a narrator who has a profound historical gender and class consciousness. As she writes in the autumn 2010 special response to a kind of special questionnaire on mass observation, which in many ways is actually, the title of that directive, I think, belies, the beauty of what it elicits, which is kind of why people write for mass observation. She writes about wanting to redress the historical injustice in the representation of the working class. I took part in mass observation to tell the truth about working class people, she writes. And so I think for her, she's someone who, Eve Worth's recent book on the welfare state generation, she's a woman who's born before that cohort. So for her, in a sense, she still finds it difficult to have a sense of entitlement to the NHS because she's not come of age within it, but she still has this sort of sense of wonder of what it's enabled her to do. She also, in her directives, though, suggests that tensions within her marriage and with her mother, who she suggests, she sort of retrospectively diagnoses her mother here, may have suffered from postnatal depression. And of course, such acts of disclosure complicate a story of class and familial solidarity. So what Margaret does instead is frame these disclosures in a sort of wonderfully idiosyncratic way. And this comes in her 2008 NHS directive response, after sort of telling one of these stories and saying how members of the family keep saying that she should write her autobiography for the sake of posterity. And she writes, "I could not write a book, as it would involve me in writing about my mother, who could be very cruel due to her mental health. I would also have to write about my husband, who was a heavy drinker and smoker, but had also had a very sad life as a child. And although these facts would have to be part of my story, I did love them both and would not like to be nasty about them. They both had big problems and neither of them had any professional help. I do not like books like the one Cherie Blair wrote, and for context, this was just after Cherie Blair's autobiography had been published. I have not read it and would not buy it if I saw it in a charity shop. Many or most of these types of book are very hurtful to somebody." By disavowing her disclosures about her mother and husband almost immediately after having made them, and not just in this directive, in other responses too, she sort of employs a similar method, but I think this is where it's most developed and most visible. Margaret contrasts her own output in the genre of mass observation writing to other genres, in particular the sort of salacious, sensationalist acts of disclosure found in the celebrity autobiography. Such approaches allow her disclosure in the framework of narrating historical fact, but also allow the maintenance of familial, gender, and class solidarity. So the next writer I'd like to consider is Helen. Now, Helen, like Margaret, was born in Wales, but with a very different class background. Both her parents were university-educated professionals. And unlike Margaret's desire for continuity with the past and intergenerational solidarity, Helen rejects the values of her parents, coming of age in the countercultural movements of the 1970s. She felt pressured by parents, she wrote, to pursue sort of academic study, but dropped out of university after a year. And she comments how alcohol, drugs, and sex became a way to rebel against the values of her middle-class upbringing. She married a fellow believer in alternative living in the early 1980s, And they eventually moved to a remote rural area to take up an agricultural smallholding with dreams of self-sufficiency. And they also started a family. But of course, all is not necessarily rosy with this new existence. Beneath it is a continual financial precarity and debt, which Helen blames on her husband's inability to manage money. There's her own experience of mental health problems in the form of postnatal depression, which, interestingly enough, and in contrast to Margaret, she actually blames this on the NHS, and it becomes a point for her to sort of dislike the service. She feels that she was coerced into a hospital supervised birth, and ironically, this kind of improves when she relocates to the rural area, because the nature of it is such that home births are more common, and she's able to then have what she wants for her subsequent experiences of giving birth. But there is a lingering distrust of biomedicine and a desire for alternative therapies. And the main point of disclosure, as I've sort of put there at the bottom for Helen, which is almost kind of threaded through her mass observation responses, is the slow disintegration of her marriage and the shifting power dynamics between Helen and her husband, John, which is also a pseudonym, by the way, I should point that out. And they eventually separate in 1996, leaving Helen as a single mother. And Helen often shoehorns her present existence into her directive responses. There is an almost deliberate effort to employ mass observation as a diary, I would argue, to vent frustration and to kind of illustrate the sort of everyday reality of her marriage. And so this slide, I won't go through all of this, but I think it really gives a flavor of how she does that. And I think what I'd like to sort of draw your attention to here, it's not just her description of John using spending the family budget, or that he enforces his taste in music on the family, the way that he sort of imagines her to, he wants her to be this sort of stereotypical housewife. But it's more the fact that this is kind of woven through multiple directives, really. Over, I mean, even here, I've only used a period of about 3 to 4 years to sort of show the way in which she's making use of mass observation in this way. But the revelation of this is often bound up with Helen's own resilience. And I think there's almost a nice link here, perhaps, to sort of the case of Grace that Corine mentioned in her paper. Writing to mass observation becomes a technology to reflect on her existence and actively imagine a life without her husband. And I think what's interesting here is how the idea of self-sufficiency becomes a proxy for this. In the summer 1993 current events directive response, for example, note that it's not we would like to be self-sufficient, but she uses the first person singular. It's I would like to be self-sufficient. And I think that becomes a way of imagining an alternative future. And this aspect of Helen's disclosure to mass observation, a space away from John's eyes and control, as you can see in the sort of bottom extract there, is one way in which she can be independent. So as much as she is speaking to and addressing total strangers, she's also able to keep something hidden and private for herself in her private world. And Helen notes that her own involvement in mass observation was partly because she wanted to enjoy this external existence and this sort of continued existence even after death. But she also sees it as cathartic. And again, what's interesting here is that this is in the context of a directive on reality television, which in other parts of her response she regards as crass and exploitative, but which she contrasts to her preferred listening in the form of desert island discs, which she feels offers a deeper personal and therapeutic connection to other people. So the last writer I want to consider is the only male voice actually in the sample, and that's Paul, who is also generationally the youngest observer in the sample that I've been looking at. Unlike the previous 2 female respondents, he is English, grammar school and university educated, though he notes that he was only successfully graduating on his 2nd attempt, having dropped out previously for mental health reasons. He also describes his class identity in more complex terms, as being sort of on the cusp of the working and middle classes. His parents were employed in working class jobs, he argues, but they also had middle class leisure pursuits. And I think he also, in a sense, fits into society in ways that Margaret and Helen don't quite do. Margaret, because she feels this sort of constant antagonism towards modern capitalist values. Helen, because she rejects a certain form of modernity. Even to the point, of course, that one of Paul's main points of pride is that he pays off his mortgage early. But what mass observation really reflects, I think, for him, are questions around his sexuality and the spaces of disclosure. Unlike some writers who are LGBT+, Paul does not consciously foreground his identity in the mass observation header, those sort of wonderful sort of mini biographies that get pinned to the top of people's responses, male, 42, Manchester, and so on. And this is revealed or indeed hidden from directive to directive. So you really have to go digging into his directives to gain a sense of the closet and its contours, if we're thinking in Eve Sedgwick's terms. So, for example, there's this sort of soft disclosure, this sort of hinting at his sexuality in certain directives. And I've always kind of read this as a sort of almost a kind of a violence of self-effacement in some ways. The fact that even in directives where he could talk about his experience as a gay man, he chooses not to, and instead says, no, I'm going to present a male version of his task and from a heterosexual perspective because it's the one that's sanctioned by legal and social tradition. And when Paul does mention his sexuality, as here, it's often, at least initially, as an aside. And again, it's almost, here he's doing it quite literally, it's almost as if he's coming out through parentheses. But there is a sense of playfulness, perhaps, in later directives, and a sense also of more comfort and composure in Summerfield's sense of the term, that he knows at least the kind of story that he wants to tell about his sexuality. Sorry. And there's a kind of double disclosure going on here as well, I think, as there is for Helen, because he not only comes out and discloses sexuality, but he also discloses that there are people he is not coming out to, specifically his work colleagues. So in a sense, he's almost disclosing to total strangers through mass observation in order not to have to disclose to others. So a few sort of conclusions and thoughts about the ethical dimensions of some of this. So on the one hand, I think that mass observation is built on these kind of layers of disclosure, these micro acts of disclosure as well as macro acts of disclosure. And I think that there's a very strong case for paying attention to these as strategies on the part of the writer over time and over the course of their contributions. Such approaches complement, but they may also contradict discourses of disclosure within the broader culture of late 20th and early 21st century Britain, from celebrity autobiographies to desert island discs. And it's, I think, always a good excuse to always revisit those kind of, the sort of the why I write directives, which have been sent out at various points throughout mass observation's existence. And I think it's also important here to acknowledge as well that the sort of the meta disclosure, the fact that writers reflect on their acts of disclosure and can often challenge it, as indeed Margaret does. So we're constantly, as readers, being kept on our toes because our readings might well be contradicted by the way that the individual writers are intellectualizing and trying to explain their own lives. And finally, really, before I finish, I'd kind of like to think about this use of pseudonymization, because this is a much more public-facing forum. But even in the article that I published, Matthew and I made a decision to use pseudonyms for the panel of writers because we felt that there was potentially identifiable information when you zoom out and look longitudinally. But it is interesting to note that, of course, in a digital world, that kind of protection can only go so far. And in fact, there are many details of disclosure and the lives of people I've talked about that I would love to have included because it gives a sense of them as living full, rich lives rather than lives of lives defined by certain problems as I've done here. But in a sense, I've kind of had to suppress that because of the fear that maybe some of this information could be Googleable and might make them more recognizable, if not to sort of members of the general public, then certainly to people who might know them. And then finally, going back to sort of Sally right at the very beginning of this paper, is pseudonymization necessarily the best way to go about this? Because isn't it just a way of reifying the person according to how we imagine them, rather like Sally imagines us or we imagine Sally? And so with that, I'll also end and conclude. And I'll try and find out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
You succeeded. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Again, really, really fascinating and wonderfully reflective, I think, of many of the experiences that we've had. In fact, I might go so far as to say I think I recognise Paul from the research I did as well. Quite a fascinating writer.